Broadway never actually celebrated art. It was a ruthless machine, engineered to consume human lives. Mary Eaton was a ballet prodigy who traded her childhood and bleeding feet to become a $1 million asset for the Ziegfeld Follies empire. She naively believed her iron discipline and absolute obedience would serve as an impenetrable shield. Yet when the economy collapsed, the very system that had worked her to death ruthlessly tossed her onto the streets without a shred of mercy. Her agonizing, solitary demise delivers a devastating verdict. The entertainment industry will always quietly discard its pristine ornaments the second they cease to be profitable. Before Broadway could so easily discard her, it first had to manufacture her. The meticulous, painful construction of Mary's innocence began in 1901 in Norfolk, Virginia, where she was born into a family that would soon become a veritable factory of theatrical labor. The 7 little Eatons, as they were later marketed to the American public, were a troupe of siblings pushed onto the stage by a fiercely ambitious mother. In the early 20th century, before the existence of stringent child labor laws or the protective oversight of modern social services, the vaudeville circuit was a brutal, relentless grind. For the Eaton family, the stage was not a place of joyous artistic expression. It was a lifeboat in a sea of working-class precarity. Their economic survival depended entirely on the children's ability to entertain paying crowds. While other children of her generation were attending school, learning mathematics, reading literature, or simply playing in the sun, Mary Eaton was living a transient, exhausting existence. The reality of vaudeville was not glamorous. It smelled of stale grease paint, damp wool, and cigar smoke. It meant riding freezing, coal-dusted trains across the vast expanse of the country, sleeping in cheap, flea-ridden boarding houses, and performing 3 separate shows a day for demanding, rowdy, and often hostile audiences. Mary's childhood was effectively stolen from her, replaced by a rigid schedule of rehearsals, train timetables, and the constant crushing pressure to earn her keep. But even within this exhausting familial machine, Mary stood out. She possessed a delicate, ethereal beauty, bright blonde hair, wide, innocent eyes, and a petite, fragile frame that made her look like a porcelain doll brought to life. However, beneath that fragile exterior lay a will of absolute titanium. Mary did not just want to be a chorus girl kicking her legs in time with the music. She wanted to be elite. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that in the brutal economy of the theater, ordinary talent was easily replaceable. To secure her future, she needed a skill that could not be easily replicated by the hundreds of other girls pouring off the trains into New York City every day. She was placed under the tutelage of Theodore Kozlov, a demanding, notoriously strict Russian ballet master who had danced with the legendary Bolshoi ballet. Kozlov did not tolerate the easy, untrained, synchronous movements typical of standard Broadway chorus lines. He demanded the highest, most punishing form of classical dance. Mary was trained to dance en pointe, supporting her entire body weight on the very tips of her toes inside rigid, glued satin blocks. Ballet is the ultimate physical manifestation of discipline, masquerading as grace. The audience in the velvet seats sees a woman floating effortlessly across the stage, a creature unburdened by gravity, moving like a feather on the wind. What they do not see is the grotesque, agonizing reality inside the shoe. To dance en pointe requires years of excruciating pain. It results in missing toenails, blistered and calloused skin, severe stress fractures, and blood seeping into the lamb's wool padding. The ballerina must smile radiantly while her skeletal structure absorbs forces that would cripple an ordinary person. This intense, isolated training forged Mary's entire psychological framework. She learned early on that pain was the price of perfection, and perfection was the only guarantee of employment. She learned to disconnect her mind from her body's suffering. While other performers of her generation were out drinking bootleg gin, courting wealthy stage door Johnnies, or networking at high society parties, Mary was at the wooden bar. She practiced her pirouettes until her muscles cramped and her vision blurred. She developed a reputation on Broadway for being flawless, obedient, and entirely focused on her craft. She did not complain. She did not demand script changes. She did not cause scandals in the press. She simply worked. This was exactly what the industry wanted her to do. By keeping her focused entirely on the microscopic mechanics of her footwork, the system ensured she remained utterly ignorant of the macroeconomic forces controlling her life. She was taught how to execute a mathematically perfect fouette turn, but she was taught absolutely nothing about financial literacy, contract negotiation, wealth management, or how to survive in a world where theaters could close. She was being groomed not as a businesswoman, but as a highly specialized luxury product. In the early 1920s, Mary's relentless, punishing work ethic caught the eye of the most powerful man in American entertainment, Florenz Ziegfeld Jr. Ziegfeld was a master manipulator of public desire, the architect of the Ziegfeld Follies. He had built his vast empire on the backs of dazzling, unattainable women, but in 1920, he was facing a severe corporate crisis. His reigning superstar, Marilyn Miller, a woman famous for her backstage tantrums, fierce independence, and aggressive contract demands, had defected to a rival producer. Ziegfeld was furious, but more importantly, he was left with a gaping hole in his multi-million-dollar production. He needed a replacement. He needed a new principal dancer to anchor his massively expensive revues, someone who possessed elite technical skill to give his shows an air of high-class legitimacy. But above all else, he needed someone who would not cause him any trouble. He needed a girl who knew her place. Mary Eaton was the perfect compliant solution. When Ziegfeld cast Mary in the Follies, she became an overnight astronomical sensation. Ziegfeld was a genius of marketing, and he immediately recognized that Mary's good girl persona was highly lucrative in a rapidly changing cultural landscape. The 1920s were a time of massive social upheaval. Women were cutting their hair short, wearing skirts that bared their knees, smoking in public, and demanding the right to vote. The dangerous, dark-lipped, sexually aggressive vamp and the rebellious flapper were terrifying to the conservative, wealthy, older men who financed Broadway. Mary Eaton was marketed as the antidote to this modern female rebellion. She was the untouchable virgin of Broadway, a palate cleanser for the tired, wealthy businessmen in the front rows. While the other Ziegfeld girls paraded around in sheer fabrics and towering headdresses, Mary was draped in pristine white silk, surrounded by soft, celestial lighting, and tasked with performing breathtaking classical ballet routines. She was the angel amidst the sinners. She starred in massive, record-breaking Broadway hits like Kid Boots, alongside the legendary comedian Eddie Cantor and the 5 O'Clock Girl. Her face was plastered across the covers of national magazines. Her name was illuminated in towering electric lights above Times Square. She was earning astronomical sums of money. Reports suggest she was making thousands of dollars a week, a salary that placed her firmly in the upper echelons of the American elite. She was the golden child of the Roaring Twenties, a woman who had seemingly achieved the impossible dream through nothing but sweat and moral fortitude. But look closely at the architecture of her success. Mary's stardom was not built on autonomy. It was built on absolute submission to a patriarchal machine. She was a multi-million-dollar asset managed entirely by men, her producers, her directors, her brothers, and her managers. They handled the money. She handled the dancing. The system rewarded her obedience with luxury, creating a gilded cage that isolated her from reality. She lived in beautiful apartments, wore the finest tailored clothing, and was treated with a reverent respect that bordered on worship. For Mary, this was the ultimate, intoxicating validation of the lie she had been fed since childhood. She looked around at the glittering reality of her life and concluded that the system was fundamentally just. She saw the bad girls, the ones who partied too hard, who talked back to directors, who showed up late, get fired and blacklisted. Meanwhile, she, who stayed sober and rehearsed for 10 hours a day, was crowned queen. She believed with the tragic, naive innocence of a highly protected child that as long as she never missed a step, the stage would always be there to catch her. She believed her discipline was a physical shield that could deflect any tragedy. She could not have known that the ground beneath her velvet slippers was hollow. She could not have known that the roaring, champagne-drenched economy of the 1920s was a massive, fragile bubble inflated by unregulated corporate debt, predatory lending, and blind, greedy speculation. Mary Eaton was dancing at the absolute pinnacle of the world, executing perfect pirouettes on the very edge of a global precipice, completely unaware that the men writing her paychecks were about to bankrupt the planet. The tragedy of the good girl is that she is entirely fatally unprepared for a world that suddenly decides to break the rules. By the late summer of 1929, Mary Eaton had reached the absolute zenith of her career. She was 28 years old, a seasoned veteran of the stage who had sacrificed her entire youth, her physical comfort, and her personal freedom to become the perfect mechanical angel of the Ziegfeld empire. She had kept her end of the bargain. She had bled into the satin shoes just as they asked. She had smiled for the cameras just as they demanded. She felt secure, insulated by the heavy velvet curtains of Broadway and the enormous comforting figures on her legal contracts. But outside the heavy brass doors of the theater, on the frantic trading floors of Wall Street, the temperature was dropping rapidly. A cold, devastating financial wind was gathering speed, preparing to tear the roof off the American dream. Mary was sitting in her dressing room, carefully tying the pink ribbons of her ballet shoes, preparing for another flawless performance, completely oblivious to the fact that the music was about to stop, the lights were about to cut out, and the powerful men who had promised to protect her were already running for the exits. The illusion of permanent, ever-expanding prosperity is the most dangerous narcotic ever engineered by a capitalist society. In the autumn of 1929, New York City was heavily sedated by it. The jazz was loud, the bootleg liquor was flowing in subterranean clubs, and the massive, ornate Broadway theaters were packed to the rafters, with men who believed that the soaring stock prices on the ticker tape were a permanent law of nature. Mary Eaton, the million-dollar angel of the Ziegfeld Follies, was 28 years old and living at the absolute epicenter of this grand delusion. She had followed every single rule of the patriarchal machine to the letter. She had traded her childhood for elite ballet training. She had maintained a spotless public reputation, and she had delivered flawless, physically punishing performances night after night without a single complaint. In return, the system had rewarded her with staggering wealth, international fame, and a false, impenetrable sense of invulnerability. She believed her iron discipline had rendered her indispensable to the industry. But the brutal reality of the entertainment economy is that no individual is indispensable. They are merely profitable until the exact second they are not. On Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the music stopped. The Wall Street crash did not just erase billions of dollars in paper wealth. It fundamentally annihilated the economic ecosystem that sustained luxury entertainment. The men who had cheerfully paid exorbitant premium prices for front row seats to watch Mary Eaton dance on pointe, the bankers, the brokers, the inheritors of gilded age fortunes, were suddenly ruined. The industrial tycoons and railroad barons who had financed the massive, sprawling productions of Florence Ziegfeld were standing in panic-stricken bank lines, staring at locked financial doors, or famously throwing themselves from the high windows of the financial district. The impact on Broadway was immediate, violent, and utterly merciless. The live entertainment economy is entirely reliant on disposable income, and overnight, disposable income ceased to exist. Massive theatrical productions with their enormous overhead costs, hundreds of cast members, live orchestras, and expensive imported silk costumes simply could not survive in a landscape where ordinary people were suddenly struggling to afford a loaf of bread. Theaters across the city went dark. The bright, pulsing electric marquees of Times Square were switched off to save municipal electricity. The grand velvet-lined auditoriums where Mary had been worshipped as a goddess were abruptly padlocked, their grand lobbies gathering dust as the city outside plunged into chaos. For Mary Eaton, the timing of the macroeconomic collapse was a catastrophic alignment of historical and biological bad luck. She was 28. In the modern world, 28 is the beginning of a woman's prime, a time of intellectual maturity and settling into one's power. But in the ruthless, predatory mathematics of the 1920s, show business machine, 28 was the terrifying precipice of obsolescence. Ziegfeld and the studio executives had already extracted the most valuable, vibrant years of her youth. They had aggressively capitalized on the novelty of her innocent, unblemished beauty when she was 20. Now, as the economy violently contracted and every single penny was heavily scrutinized by nervous investors, producers were already looking over her shoulder. They were looking toward the next crop of desperate 18-year-old girls stepping off the trains from the Midwest, girls who were willing to work for an absolute fraction of Mary's established salary just to escape the grinding poverty of the Depression. Furthermore, the physical toll of her specific discipline was catching up with her. A classical ballerina at 28 possesses a body that has been subjected to a decade and a half of sustained micro-traumatic abuse. The joints ache, the bones of the feet are irreparably altered, and the effortless grace requires twice the effort to maintain. She was becoming an expensive, aging luxury in a market that could no longer afford basic necessities. When the money stopped flowing, the cruelty of the system was laid bare in the most structural, undeniable way possible. The elite producers did not protect their stars. Florence Ziegfeld himself lost an estimated $3 million in the crash and was desperately trying to salvage his own sinking empire, terrified of his creditors. He had no time, no capital, and no inclination to act as a safety net for the women he had made famous. The protective bubble burst. There were no severance packages. There were no actors' unions with the power to demand fair compensation or breach of contract settlements. There were no pensions, no health insurance, and no psychological support for the performers who had literally bled into their shoes to generate revenue for their bosses. The system simply unlatched the golden cage, declared bankruptcy, and threw the birds out into the freezing wind. This is where the true terrifying tragedy of Mary Eaton's specific discipline reveals itself. The industry had spent 2 decades meticulously training her to do one highly specialized, incredibly difficult thing: classical ballet. It had demanded her total unwavering focus to perfect the mechanics of a pirouette and the rigid balance required to dance en pointe. But in demanding this singular focus, the system had deliberately insulated her from the real world. It had actively prevented her from developing any other transferable skills. Mary Eaton did not know how to type. She did not know how to manage a business. She had no formal education beyond the rehearsal studio. She had been completely sheltered from financial management, taxes, and investments by the men who controlled her contracts and her bank accounts. The industry had vended her as a fragile, helpless angel, and in doing so, it had successfully engineered her actual helplessness. She was a woman holding a highly refined, aristocratic skill in a world that had suddenly reverted to basic, brutal survival. A starving man standing in a mile-long bread line does not care about the perfect execution of a pas de bourrée. Mary's core value, her pristine high society grace, had been rendered instantly worthless by the stock market. She was a luxury good in a soup kitchen economy. Desperate to survive, to maintain her lifestyle, and to prove that she was still relevant, Mary attempted to pivot to the only other avenue available: the rapidly expanding, chaotic world of Hollywood and talking pictures. Vaudeville was dead, killed by the microphone and the silver screen, and Broadway was on life support. In 1929, just as the financial world was beginning to fracture, she starred alongside the anarchic Marx Brothers in their first feature film, The Coconuts, filmed at the Astoria Studios in Queens. Later that same year, she secured the lead role in Glorifying the American Girl, a film produced by Ziegfeld himself as a desperate, ultimately doomed attempt to monetize his stage brand for the cinema. But the transition was a devastating failure, and the reasons for this failure exposed the brutal shift in American culture and the technological limitations of the era. The camera is a cruel, intimate interrogator. It requires a completely different technique than the stage. In 1929, early sound cameras were massive, immobile blocks housed in soundproof booths. The actors had to stand rigidly near hidden microphones, destroying the fluid movement that was Mary's greatest asset. Her theatrical acting style, designed to project emotion to the back row of a massive 3,000-seat Broadway house, felt stiff, overly pronounced, and archaic when magnified on a movie screen. Her crystalline stage diction sounded theatrical and falls through the primitive audio equipment. More importantly, the psychological needs of the American public had shifted overnight. The terrified, impoverished masses sitting in dark cinemas to escape the freezing winter no longer wanted to see wealthy, ethereal fairies dancing on their toes in imported silk costumes. They didn't want the untouchable aristocratic innocence that Mary Eaton sold. It reminded them of the excess of the 1920s, the very excess that had just bankrupted the country and stolen their jobs. Instead, audiences wanted the chaotic, anti-establishment anarchy of the Marx Brothers, who tore down the high society structures, mocked wealthy dowagers, and ridiculed authority figures. Or they wanted the gritty, cynical, hardened realism of the new pre-code Hollywood actresses, women like Barbara Stanwyck, Joan Crawford, or Jean Harlow. These new stars played working-class women, shop girls, and hustlers who looked like they knew how to take a punch, stretch a dollar, and survive a breadline. They were survivors. Mary Eaton looked like a casualty. In The Coconuts, Mary played the straight romantic lead, a thankless, isolating role that required her to stand by innocently while the Marx Brothers destroyed the scenery. The audience did not care about the straight lead's romantic woes. They cared about the chaos because chaos was the new reality of their daily lives. Her rigid, classical perfection felt profoundly outdated, a relic of a despised, dead decade. The Hollywood studios looked at the box office returns, looked at her age, looked at the shifting cultural tides, and quietly, efficiently dropped her. The process of being discarded by the entertainment industry is not usually a dramatic, screaming confrontation. It is a slow, suffocating silence. It is the telephone sitting dead on the receiver for days, then weeks. It is the agent stopping his daily visits, offering vague excuses about shifting trends. It is the sudden realization that the scripts being sent are smaller, cheaper, and less frequent, until they stop arriving entirely. For Mary, the psychological trauma of this erasure was absolute and completely debilitating. She had done everything right. She had stayed sober while her peers partied themselves into oblivion. She had worked harder, trained longer, and remained fiercely loyal to her employers. She had worked herself to the bone, believing the fundamental structural lie that obedience and discipline would purchase lifelong protection. The realization that her discipline had not protected her, that her virtue was useless currency, and that she was just as disposable as the girls who had recklessly thrown their careers away, shattered her internal compass. If the rules she had followed her entire life were a lie, then what was the point of the discipline? What happens to a workaholic when the work ceases to exist? The intense, focused energy that Mary had poured into her ballet training did not just disappear. It turned inward, and it became deeply, violently destructive. She found herself staring at the walls of an increasingly quiet apartment, confronting the terrifying void of her own obsolescence. She was the crown jewel of the Ziegfeld empire, suddenly appraised as worthless overnight by a panicked, crashing world. The system had taken her childhood, broken her toes, monetized her beauty, squeezed out her youth, and when the market crashed, it had simply turned its back and walked away. They left her with no map, no compass, and absolutely no idea how to survive in the dark. The silence of a dead telephone is the loudest, most deafening sound in the world. To a woman who has spent her entire life addicted to the roar of a standing ovation. As the grim, gray reality of the 1930s settled over America like a shroud, Mary Eaton realized the terrifying extent of her isolation. The wealthy men who had called her an angel, who had sent her dressing room overflowing with orchids, now refused to take her calls. The industry that had demanded her total unwavering devotion had abandoned her without a second thought. Busy scrambling to save its own executives, she was stranded in the wreckage of the Great Depression, a beautifully engineered, flawlessly tuned machine with no power source and no purpose. Stripped of the stage, she was stripped of her identity. She began to desperately search for a new anchor, a new system of protection to replace the one that had just collapsed beneath her feet. But the men she would turn to for salvation were just as flawed, just as desperate, and just as vulnerable as the economy that had ruined her. The discipline that had defined her existence was gone. The desperation had arrived, and the broken angel was about to discover exactly how far a person can fall when there is no stage left to catch them. The most dangerous hour for a workaholic is the moment they wake up and realize there is absolutely nothing they are required to do. For Mary Eaton, The early 1930s were defined by this crushing daily paralysis. She had spent the first 28 years of her life in a state of perpetual, orchestrated motion. Every hour of her existence had been meticulously scheduled by the Ziegfeld machine: morning stretches, vocal coaching, costume fittings, matinee performances, evening shows, and the mandatory supervised appearances at high society gatherings. Her identity was entirely synonymous with her output. When the Great Depression eradicated the Broadway economy and Hollywood unceremoniously rejected her classical acting style, Mary was not just left unemployed, she was left psychologically amputated. To understand the terrifying void that opened up beneath her, you must understand the physical and mental conditioning of an elite ballerina. A dancer's body is a highly tuned instrument that requires constant punishing maintenance. When the rigorous 10-hour training days abruptly stopped, the adrenaline that had masked a decade of chronic physical trauma evaporated. The brutalized joints, the hairline fractures in her feet, and the torn ligaments, injuries she had been taught to ignore for the sake of the spotlight, began to ache with a dull, relentless throb. She was trapped in a quiet apartment, imprisoned in a body that was physically deteriorating from the very discipline that had once made her a millionaire. The stage had been her only outlet, her only language, and her only mechanism for proving her worth to the world. Without it, the silence of her life was deafening. In a capitalist society, when a woman is stripped of her independent economic value, she is culturally conditioned to seek protection through the patriarchal institution of marriage. Mary Eaton had been raised in an industry entirely controlled by men. Male producers had dictated her schedule. Male directors had controlled her image, and male financiers had written her paychecks. She had been conditioned to view male authority not as a threat, but as a necessary shield against the harsh realities of the world. Therefore, when the studio system collapsed and abandoned her, it was an entirely logical, almost instinctual reaction for Mary to seek a new savior in the form of a husband. If she could no longer be the million-dollar asset of a production company, she would become the protected asset of a successful man. In 1929, just as the financial walls were beginning to cave in, Mary married Millard Webb. Webb was a prominent Hollywood film director, a man who had successfully navigated the transition from the silent era and directed major stars like John Barrymore. On paper, it was a perfectly strategic alliance. Webb represented the new guard, the emerging dominance of the California film industry over the dying New York stage. By marrying a director, Mary was attempting to secure a permanent anchor in the very medium that was actively rejecting her. She was trying to buy her way back into the fortress of relevance through the side door of matrimony. But the cruel reality of the Great Depression was that no one was truly safe, not even the men who supposedly controlled the cameras. The film industry, while faring marginally better than live theater, was undergoing brutal corporate restructuring. The banks were tightening their grip on the studios, demanding absolute financial efficiency and ruthless budget cuts. Millard Webb, despite his previous successes, found himself caught in this ruthless corporate downsizing. The pressure to produce cheap, rapid-fire hits took a massive toll on the directors of the era. The security Mary thought she had purchased with her marriage was an illusion. Instead of being a protected housewife, she found herself trapped in a household vibrating with the identical suffocating anxiety of industry rejection that she was trying to escape. The marriage was a pressure cooker, of two obsolescent talents watching their era die. Webb's career began a steep, humiliating decline, and the financial stress of maintaining a Hollywood lifestyle without a Hollywood income began to tear the relationship apart. The ultimate devastating blow arrived in 1935 when Millard Webb died prematurely of intestinal complications at the age of 42. Mary was 34 years old. She was a widow, a washed-up actress, and a woman whose financial reserves were rapidly evaporating. The death of Millard Webb did not just rob her of a husband, it robbed her of the final shred of the illusion that a man could save her from the mechanics of the economy. The patriarchal safety net had completely failed. The psychological collapse of Mary Eaton began in earnest during this period of intense compounding grief and isolation. Human beings are remarkably resilient creatures when they have a clear enemy to fight, but Mary had no enemy. She could not fight the stock market. She could not fight the shifting cultural tastes of the American public. She could not fight the fact that sound cameras made her voice sound artificial. She was fighting a phantom, the absolute crushing indifference of the universe. When a person who has operated on strict iron discipline their entire life finally breaks, the snap is violent and catastrophic. Mary had spent her youth denying herself every indulgence. While the flappers of the 1920s had medicated their post-war trauma with bootleg gin and jazz, Mary had stayed sober, hydrating with water and punishing her body at the ballet bar. She had banked her sobriety and her good behavior, believing it would yield a lifelong dividend of security. When she realized that the bank was bankrupt and her virtue was entirely worthless currency, she felt a profound destructive sense of betrayal. If the rules were a lie, why continue to follow them? To suddenly transform into a hardened, financially savvy survivor in the middle of the worst economic collapse in modern history, Mary Eaton was a casualty of a structural inequality that viewed women's labor as highly profitable but inherently disposable. When the financial systems collapsed, the very first safety nets to be cut were those belonging to the women who served as the industry's aesthetic ornaments. The tragedy of her alcoholism was not a failure of her willpower. It was the inevitable chemical result of a human being who had been systematically stripped of her purpose, her income, and her dignity, and who was left with absolutely no tools to rebuild her life. As the 1930s drew to a close and the world began to march steadily toward the precipice of the Second World War, Mary Eaton became a ghost haunting her own life. She had tried to play by the rules. She had tried to secure herself through marriage. She had tried to adapt to the changing times. But every single escape route had been sealed shut. The men had died or left. The money had evaporated, and the studios had locked their gates. She was a woman completely out of time, a relic of the gaslit, champagne-drenched 1920s, stranded in a harsh, cynical new world that bore absolutely no resemblance to the one she had conquered. The ballet shoes were packed away in a dark closet, the silk ribbons fraying, the satin stained with the blood of a decade of useless sacrifice. The spotlight had formally, permanently been switched off. The audience had gone home. The theater doors were locked. And Mary Eaton, the broken angel of Broadway, was about to begin the final, most terrifying phase of her existence, the long, silent wait in the dark. There is a specific, agonizing psychological torture reserved exclusively for those who have stood at the absolute center of the universe, only to be forcibly evicted into the shadows. As the brutal, grinding poverty of the 1930s slowly transitioned into the militarized, frantic industrial boom of the 1940s, America was fundamentally transforming. The nation was gearing up for the Second World War. The cultural landscape shifted drastically. The public no longer desired the ethereal aristocratic escapism of the Ziegfeld Follies. They wanted the brassy, resilient, girl-next-door patriotism of Betty Grable and Rita Hayworth. The entertainment industry, functioning as a ruthless mirror of public demand, pivoted instantly. And in this rapid, aggressive pivot, Mary Eaton was not just left behind, she was actively erased. To comprehend the depth of Mary's despair during these years, you must understand the toxicity of nostalgia for a discarded star. Nostalgia for the ordinary person is a warm, comforting look back at a simpler time. But for a woman whose entire identity, financial security, and self-worth were tied to a specific era that the world has aggressively repudiated, nostalgia is a poison. Every time Mary looked in the mirror, she did not just see a woman aging, she saw a depreciated asset. She saw a face that had once commanded millions of dollars, now ignored by the very same studio executives who used to send her daily floral arrangements. She was trapped in the agonizing purgatory of being alive, yet culturally dead. Her daily reality became a masterclass in the sorrow of disappearing. Imagine walking down a street in Los Angeles, surrounded by the bustling, ruthless energy of the Hollywood machine. You are walking past studios where you once headlined major motion pictures. You pass theaters where your name was once etched in towering electric lights. But the pedestrians rushing past you do not stop. The producers driving by in their luxury cars do not wave. You have become entirely invisible. The ultimate punishment for a woman who was conditioned from childhood to believe that her only value lay in being watched is a life where no one bothers to look at her at all. In a final desperate bid to anchor herself to the world of the living, Mary entered into her third and final marriage. She wed John Chasel. To understand this marriage, we must strip away the romantic illusions that Hollywood sells us. This was not a sweeping, passionate love story. It was an act of survival. In the middle of the 20th century, a discarded, aging, unemployed actress with a rapidly escalating alcohol dependency had virtually no structural avenues for self-rescue. The banking system was unforgiving, the studios were closed to her, and the patriarchal society dictated that a woman's ultimate safety net was a husband. Mary was frantically trying to follow the only script she had left. She believed that if she could just secure a stable marriage, she could artificially reconstruct the protective barrier that Florenz Ziegfeld had once provided. But a marriage certificate cannot cure a systemic wound. John Chasel, whatever his initial intentions may have been, was stepping into a household consumed by the phantom limbs. She turned to the only reliable comfort available to the discarded elite of the 1930s, alcohol. But Mary Eaton did not drink like a socialite at a cocktail party. She did not drink to enhance a celebration or to participate in the glamorous, chaotic nightlife of Hollywood. She drank with the dark, solitary, mechanical efficiency of a woman seeking a chemical lobotomy. Alcohol is the great equalizer. It does not care if you were once the principal dancer of the Ziegfeld Follies. It does not care if your face was once illuminated above Times Square. It simply lowers the volume of the accusing voices in your head. For Mary, the bottle became the only entity in her life that did not demand perfection, did not critique her age, and did not care that she could no longer execute a flawless pirouette. It was a medication used to numb the sharp, agonizing memories of her past glory and to anesthetize the physical pain of her ruined, deformed feet. The discipline that had once defined her entire existence completely dissolved, replaced by the sloppy, chaotic surrender to the numbing embrace of liquor. Her descent was not a secret. In the incestuous, highly observant ecosystem of Hollywood, failure is a spectator sport. The industry executives and former colleagues who had once worshipped her now watched her decline with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. The woman who had been marketed as the untouchable, pristine angel of Broadway was now frequently seen intoxicated, struggling to maintain the facade of her former elegance. The whispers began. She was labeled difficult, unreliable, and tragic, the three fatal adjectives that guarantee a woman will never be hired again in the entertainment industry. The system that had created her fragility now used that very fragility as the justification for permanently blacklisting her. In a desperate, almost frantic attempt to stop her freefall, Mary married for a second time. She wed Charlie Lemaire, a highly talented costume designer who had worked extensively in vaudeville and Broadway, and who would later go on to become one of the most powerful wardrobe executives at 20th Century Fox. Lemaire was a man of the theater, someone who understood the exact nature of the world Mary had lost. Perhaps she believed that by marrying a man who dressed stars, she could somehow remain adjacent to the stardom that had been stripped from her. But Lemaire, during the years of their marriage, was battling his own intense demons and navigating the treacherous, unstable transition from stage to screen. The marriage was reportedly fraught with tension, exacerbated by Mary's deepening dependency on alcohol and the suffocating, unresolvable grief of her lost career. Two people drowning in the same ocean cannot act as life rafts for each other. They only pull each other down faster. The marriage to Lemaire ended in a bitter, highly destructive divorce, leaving Mary even more emotionally fractured and financially depleted than before. She was systematically shedding the glittering armor of her youth. The heavy imported diamond necklaces, the custom-tailored silk gowns, and the expensive real estate that had once been the tactical markers of her Ziegfeld ownership were pawned, sold, or lost to creditors to pay for her living expenses and her growing addiction. She was forced to downgrade her living situation, moving from the palatial, sprawling homes of her peak into smaller, increasingly unremarkable apartments. She was sliding backwards down the socioeconomic ladder she had spent her entire adolescence climbing, a painful, humiliating reversal of the American dream. This period of her life sparks a sobering, critical debate regarding the structure of the early entertainment industry and its treatment of women. For decades, the simplistic patriarchal narrative surrounding women like Mary Eaton was one of personal moral failure, that they were simply weak, tragic figures who couldn't handle the psychological pressure of fading fame and resorted to the bottle out of a lack of character. This narrative conveniently absolves the industry of any responsibility. However, modern historical interpretation violently shifts the blame back onto the system itself. Mary Eaton was not weak. She was deliberately unequipped. The Ziegfeld machine and the studio system operated on a business model of predatory paternalism. They intentionally kept their female stars in a state of arrested development, actively discouraging them from understanding their own finances, seeking higher education, or developing any identity outside of their physical appearance. They treated these women like highly valuable, pampered children. But when the economic apocalypse of the Great Depression struck, the fathers of the industry abandoned their children without a second thought. How can a society reasonably expect a woman who has been treated as a decorative child her entire life of Mary's past glory? He was not marrying the $1 million angel of Broadway. He was marrying the collateral damage of the Great Depression. The marriage to Chessel inevitably buckled under the crushing weight of Mary's unresolvable trauma. You cannot build a stable future with a person who's entirely, obsessively consumed by the loss of their past. As the relationship deteriorated, ending in yet another quiet, humiliating separation, the last remaining pillars of Mary's psychological infrastructure collapsed. The narrative was complete. The industry had rejected her, the public had forgotten her, and the institution of marriage had failed to save her. She was entirely, fundamentally alone. It was during this period of profound, impenetrable isolation that her reliance on alcohol transitioned from a coping mechanism into a physiological necessity. We must examine Mary's alcoholism not through the judgmental, moralistic lens of the era, but through the clinical, empathetic lens of trauma response. Mary Eaton was a woman experiencing absolute structural betrayal. When the human mind cannot process the scale of its own loss, it seeks an anesthetic. For Mary, alcohol was the only reliable entity left in her existence. The bottle did not demand that she endure the agonizing pain of a pointe shoe. It did not care that the harsh Hollywood cameras found her acting style outdated. It did not judge her for losing her fortune. It simply offered a temporary chemical lobotomy. It lowered the volume of the silence in her empty apartment. But the physical irony of her addiction is perhaps the most tragic element of her story. Mary Eaton had spent the first 2 decades of her life treating her body as a sacred, elite temple. A classical ballerina's body is a marvel of biomechanical engineering, built on strict hydration, severe dietary restrictions, and thousands of hours of cardiovascular and muscular conditioning. She had possessed one of the most highly disciplined, perfectly tuned physical instruments on the planet. Now, that exact same iron discipline was inverted. The sheer stamina that had allowed her to dance through bleeding feet and torn ligaments was now being used to sustain massive toxic quantities of alcohol. Her body, trained to endure extreme punishment for the sake of art, was now enduring extreme punishment for the sake of oblivion. The physiological breakdown of a dancer's body through severe alcoholism is a slow, grueling, and deeply undignified process. Alcohol is a systemic toxin. It attacks the muscular definition she had worked her entire childhood to build. It attacks the central nervous system, eroding the precise microscopic balance and coordination that had once allowed her to execute flawless pirouettes on a Broadway stage. And most devastatingly, it attacks the liver. Liver cirrhosis does not happen overnight. It is the result of years of sustained heavy drinking, a slow scarring of the organ until it simply ceases to filter the poison from the blood. As the 1940s progressed, Mary's physical appearance began to drastically alter. The ethereal porcelain fragility that Ziegfeld had monetized was gone. She became swollen, jaundiced, and deeply fatigued. The physical degradation was a visible outward manifestation of the internal structural rot of the capitalist machine that had used her up. This brings us to a critical historical debate regarding the treatment of discarded entertainers. Society loves a comeback story, but it possesses a deep sociopathic disgust for those who failed to come back. When stars like Mary Eaton fell into addiction, the culture of the 1940s blamed them entirely. They were viewed as weak, immoral, or tragic figures who had squandered their blessings. The gossip columns, when they bothered to mention her at all, framed her decline as a cautionary tale of personal failing. But this narrative is a deliberate, defensive lie engineered by the industry itself. By blaming Mary for her alcoholism, the studio executives, the producers, and the financial backers absolved themselves of their own complicity. They did not want the public to realize that the entertainment machine was a predatory engine that consumed youth and excreted broken human beings. They did not want to admit that they had built an entire economy on the backs of young women, denied them financial education, denied them union protections, and then summarily executed their careers the moment the stock market dipped. Mary Eaton's alcoholism was not a personal moral failing. It was a predictable, almost inevitable occupational hazard of a highly exploitative industry. When you teach a woman that her only value to society is her physical perfection, and then you strip her of the means to display that perfection, you are effectively destroying her reason to exist. You are leaving her alone in a dark room with a loaded gun and then acting surprised when she pulls the trigger. The alcohol was just the bullet she chose. By the mid-1940s, Mary Eaton was living in Los Angeles, a city built entirely on the industry that had destroyed her. It is a unique kind of hell to be trapped in the very geography of your own failure. She was surrounded by the sprawling mansions of the new studio executives and the buzzing energy of the post-war boom, yet she was living in the shadows, her bank accounts drained, her health failing rapidly. The woman who had once starred alongside the Marx Brothers, who had shared the stage with Eddie Cantor, who had been the literal poster child for the American dream, was now just another anonymous, ailing woman in a vast, indifferent metropolis. She did not have an entourage. She did not have a publicist spinning her decline into a sympathetic narrative. She was fighting a solitary, losing battle against her own failing biology. The tragedy of the invisible one is that her suffering generates no capital. Because she was no longer profitable, her pain was culturally irrelevant. The system that had meticulously documented her every smile, her every dance step, and her every costume change when she was making the millions, now turned a blind eye as she slowly poisoned herself to death. They had the resources to send her to the finest sanitariums in the world. They had the capital to intervene, but the ledger had been closed. The investment had been written off, and Mary Eaton was left to navigate the final terrifying descent entirely on her own. As the calendar turned toward the late 1940s, the physical reality of Mary Eaton's internal damage could no longer be ignored or self-medicated. The pain in her abdomen was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp, urgent alarm. The liver, the silent, resilient filter of the human body, was shutting down. Her world, which had once encompassed the grand stages of New York, the sprawling film sets of Astoria, and the glittering parties of the Roaring Twenties, shrank down to the perimeter of a small, quiet room in Hollywood. The silence that had haunted her for over a decade was now absolute. There were no more auditions to fail, no more marriages to attempt, no more illusions to maintain. The relentless, punishing machinery of the American entertainment industry had finally extracted its last ounce of blood. The broken angel was grounded, her wings clipped not by a sudden dramatic tragedy, but by the slow, suffocating apathy of the men who had once called her a star. The final curtain was preparing to fall, and there was absolutely no one sitting in the audience. The human body is an infallible ledger. It keeps a meticulous, unforgiving record of every trauma, every chemical ingested, and every psychological blow endured. By the summer of 1948, The ledger of Mary Eaton's life was being violently reconciled. The woman who had once possessed the most highly disciplined, perfectly calibrated physical instrument on the American stage was now trapped in a state of rapid, irreversible biological collapse. The severity of end-stage liver cirrhosis is a brutal, undignified reality. It is a disease that systematically dismantles the architecture of the body. The liver, unable to filter the toxins that Mary had consumed to numb the agony of her obsolescence, allowed fluid to build up in her abdomen. Her skin, once the pristine porcelain focal point of Ziegfeld's million-dollar lighting rigs, turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The legs that had executed flawless fouette turns, the feet that had bled into satin pointe shoes for the entertainment of Wall Street billionaires were now swollen, immobile, and entirely useless. She was 47 years old, an age when a woman should be stepping into the quiet, assured power of midlife. Instead, she was dying in a small, sterile hospital bed in Hollywood, completely unrecognizable from the angelic icon she had once been. To fully grasp the chilling cruelty of her final days, one must look at the world operating just outside the windows of her hospital ward. The year was 1948. America had emerged victorious from the Second World War, and the economy was roaring with a new militarized industrial might. Hollywood was entering the absolute zenith of its golden age. A few miles away from Mary's failing body, the major studio lots of MGM, Warner Brothers, and Paramount were churning out Technicolor musicals and glamorous noirs, generating unprecedented billions in global revenue. The executives were building sprawling estates in Beverly Hills. A new generation of starlets, women like Marilyn Monroe and Ava Gardner, were being meticulously constructed, packaged, and monetized by the exact same patriarchal machinery that had manufactured Mary. The entertainment industry had never been richer, more powerful, or more culturally dominant. Yet for Mary Eaton, the architect of the 1920s Broadway boom, the creator of the wealth that helped build the foundation of this industry, there was absolutely nothing. The studio bosses driving past her hospital in their imported European cars did not know she was there. And if they had known, they would not have cared. She was a depreciated asset from a dead era. The system operates on a terrifying sociopathic forward momentum. It does not look backward to rescue the workers whose youth it has already consumed. Mary was experiencing the ultimate structural isolation of the capitalist machine. To be surrounded by the unimaginable wealth of the industry you helped build, while dying in absolute poverty because you are no longer useful to the men who control the capital. As July of 1948 wore on, the physical pain intensified, but the psychological silence was perhaps the heavier burden. The hospital room was devoid of the chaotic, vibrant energy that had defined her youth. There were no frantic wardrobe assistants pinning silk to her bodice. There were no orchestras tuning their instruments in the orchestra pit. There were no reporters shouting her name. There was only the low mechanical hum of the hospital ward, the squeak of nurses' rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, and the slow, labored sound of her own breathing. When you spend your formative years conditioned to believe that your only value to the world is your ability to generate applause, the absence of that applause feels like non-existence. Mary was disappearing long before her heart actually stopped beating. She was a woman who had followed every single rule of the good girl narrative. She had not rebelled. She had not caused scandals. Lying in that bed, she was forced to confront the devastating truth that her virtue had been entirely weaponized against her. It had kept her docile, compliant, and easy to exploit, preventing her from developing the hardened cynicism required to survive the crash of 1929. On July 21st, 1948, the struggle finally concluded. Mary Eaton suffered a massive heart attack, brought on by the severe complications of her cirrhosis. She breathed her last breath in a small Hollywood hospital, far removed from the glittering velvet-lined theaters of New York City, where she had once reigned supreme. The death of a million-dollar star should, theoretically, stop the world. But when Mary died, the world did not even pause to take a breath. Her passing was met with a chilling, absolute void of industry recognition. There were no state funerals. There were no massive crowds of weeping fans blocking the streets. The newspapers, the very same publications that had once dedicated entire front-page spreads to her latest stage roles, her flawless beauty, and her angelic innocence, relegated her death to tiny, unremarkable blurbs buried deep in the back pages. The headlines did not read "Broadway Goddess Passes Away." They read with clinical dismissive brevity, "Former Follies dancer dies." This is the mechanics of historical erasure in real time. The industry could not afford to eulogize Mary Eaton loudly, because to do so would require acknowledging the brutal reality of what they had done to her. It would require admitting that the Ziegfeld machine and the studio system were predatory engines that chewed up young, disciplined women, spat them out the moment the economy dipped, and left them to die of alcoholism in cheap hospital wards. Society loves the myth of the tragic fallen star who destroyed herself, but it violently rejects the reality of a worker systematically destroyed by her employers. By keeping her death quiet, the industry maintained its glittering illusion. They swept the collateral damage of the Great Depression under the rug, ensuring that the next generation of naive starlets arriving in Los Angeles would not see the bloodstains on the floor, the historical controversy surrounding Mary Eaton's life and death, forces us to completely reevaluate the way we view the victims of the entertainment industry. For decades, the patriarchal narrative has framed women who struggle with post-fame addiction as weak, tragic figures lacking moral fortitude. But this interpretation is a defensive lie. Mary's story demands that we shift the indictment from the individual to the structure. She did not fail because she lacked discipline. She had more discipline in her bleeding toes than most studio executives had in their entire bodies. She failed because she was trapped in an economic system that viewed female labor as highly profitable but inherently disposable. Her life is a glaring, uncomfortable historical precedent for the extreme vulnerability of workers in any industry that treats human beings as temporary commodities. She represents the terrifying truth of the modern gig economy, the disposable nature of social media influencers, and the precarious reality of contract workers. When you possess a highly specialized skill but hold absolutely no ownership over the means of production, when you do not own the theater, the camera, or the platform, you are entirely at the mercy of the men who do. And when a macroeconomic crisis hits, whether it is the Wall Street crash of 1929 or a modern financial recession, the protective rhetoric of the employer instantly vanishes. The safety nets are cut, and the workers are jettisoned to save the executives. Mary Eaton is the ultimate heartbreaking proof that relying on the goodwill of an employer without structural, legal, and financial protections is a guaranteed path to ruin. To look at the arc of Mary Eaton's life is to look at the fragility of the American dream stripped of all its cinematic lighting. She was the pristine angel who was sold a lie, who danced until she broke, and who was left to die in the dark when the audience ran out of money. The tragedy of her existence is not merely that she succumbed to addiction. It is that she was placed in a position where addiction was the only rational, accessible anesthetic for the structural trauma she endured. When we look back at the glittering, champagne-soaked images of the 1920s Ziegfeld Follies, we must force ourselves to look past the ostrich feathers, the pearls, and the dazzling smiles. We must see the blood inside the satin shoes. We must recognize the brutal, calculated transaction occurring on that stage. Florenz Ziegfeld and the titans of industry did not worship Mary Eaton. They worshiped the wealth her suffering generated for them. Mary Eaton is buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, a cemetery populated by the ghosts of Hollywood's golden age. Her grave is quiet, a stark, devastating contrast to the deafening roar of the standing ovation she once commanded. She rests there as a permanent, silent warning to every young, ambitious person who believes that playing by the rules will keep them safe. Her life leaves us with a profound, terrifying moral lesson. The capitalist machine will gladly take your youth, your discipline, your health, and your unbroken spirit. It will dress you in gold and tell you that you are indispensable. But the spotlight is never a home. It is only a temporary rental. The love of the public is a fickle, transactional illusion, heavily dependent on the stability of the stock market. And when the wrinkles appear, when the voice fades, or when the economy collapses, the system will not write you a thank you note. It will simply look past you, push you into the shadows, and quietly hand your perfectly polished crown to the next girl waiting in the wings. Mary Eaton did not just lose her career. She was erased by a machine functioning exactly as it was designed to function. The greatest tragedy of the broken angel is not that she fell, but that when she hit the ground, the world she had sacrificed everything to entertain did not even bother to look down.